welcome back to another episode of Brand My Career. And today I'm lucky enough to have Adam Forbes with me. Adam is podcast host and author of Corporate Escapology and the program director at Startup Bootcamp. So thanks for joining me, Adam.
Great. No, very happy to be here. Thanks, Alex.
So I'm really excited to be diving in and hearing a bit about the book and what's inside it. But I was keen to first start with hearing a bit of your story that's led you to this point. So what's your career story? What's led you to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, a bunch of things, I suppose. I mean, firstly, I didn't ever really expect to write this book. I had a hope that I might write a book at some stage, but I didn't really think it would be this book. I had spent maybe nearly 20 years maybe working in corporate jobs. And when I got a chance to go for voluntary redundancy, my confidence was very high, which was unusual, I think. I don't think it had always been very high while working in various jobs, but it was actually high. And so it was a good time to leave. And I started, as soon as I left, I knew I wanted to do lots of things because I felt like I'd had this very linear career, sort of mono career, really. And I knew I wanted to try lots and lots of things. It was variety I was really craving. And one of the things I started doing was writing about the experience of leaving a corporate and experimenting with a bunch of things, different things I was doing. And through that experience of writing, of course, you find people who are going through a similar sort of experience. And I found it relatively easy to write, relatively easy to seem to tap into what other people were feeling. And then gradually I thought, well, maybe there's a book in this, really. So that's what led me to eventually take parts of the blog, but I mean, it was quite different, really. But it made me think, actually, there's a need here for people who are in corporate jobs who aren't necessarily feeling it's serving them in the same way it once was, or maybe they're feeling trapped, to see that there is a way out without necessarily taking huge risks, which I think is what keeps a lot of people in those jobs. And so I started as part of the blog, but through other things too, I started just researching, talking to lots and lots of people. And I started to see that actually there was maybe a method and I could share that method. It was really the method I adopted, but it was largely unconscious. I think it is for a lot of people. I just thought, well, maybe if I spell it out and make it conscious, maybe it'll be easier for people. They'll feel less trapped and they'll maybe find their own ways out, and maybe they'll find a bit more happiness, a bit more purpose, a bit more fulfillment, maybe, and enjoy life more. That's the goal.
Yeah, awesome. And we'll dig into that those 5 steps in a little bit. So, so you're in the corporate world for quite some time. For you, was it a long period of time that you were feeling an itch to move out and into a different space of your career, or was it sort of a sudden thing where you woke up one day and realized, I don't want to be here anymore?
No, and to be honest, it was never really like, I really don't want to be here. I don't remember being one of those people that sort of particularly dreaded Sunday nights. I mean, there were particular weeks, of course, when that happened, but it was a continuous, I guess, a sort of rhythm throughout the year that I would think, actually, I don't want to be here anymore. And it would typically be around holiday time where I would have that break because, I'd be busy at work. And then I'd have holidays, Christmas, summer holidays, Easter. And I just think, God, I don't want to be here this time next year. I wonder what. And I actually like change as well. So, and, in corporates, there's quite a lot of change, although there's an awful lot of continuity. There's an awful lot of restructures happening, certainly where I was working. You didn't need to really wait much longer than 2 years and it would all be changed again. And I quite liked that. I think that probably kept me in the company longer because of that. But it was almost from the start, I was thinking, what else can I do? What else? What could I do? And then I started to be a bit trapped, I suppose, and maybe a bit consciously trapped. Young family, wanting to kind of get on the ladder with houses and get the kids sorted for schools. And so I think for a long time it served me really well being there, and I was consciously trapped. And then maybe over time I started thinking, there must be more. There must be more than this. And I suppose there's sort of these trigger moments where you're just like leaving the house early in the morning and you haven't seen the kids the night before either, and you're back on a train again to London or wherever. And I suppose those were moments I just thought, crikey, I've got one chance at this. I'm not sure I'm using it really, really well. So, so those were moments. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, like it's we've all got a different way in which that plays out, because like for me, I'm probably in a position where I'm actually heading more towards corporate employment than I had in the beginning. I had the same sort of moments when I was working as a tradesman and having days where you're sort of out on the tools and sort of going, and your body's aching, and, and you're sort of going, oh, there's got to be more. And it moved me sort of more towards that space. And so it's, I think what's good is some of the things that you've identified. It helps people sort of get to that point for themselves of like, where's the right place for me and why, and
Yeah, and I think
about actually making that happen.
it's interesting that you say that too about going into it, because I really didn't want the book to be, and I don't feel it either. I didn't want it to be like corporates are bad and it's a terrible place to find yourself. I want it to be really a celebration of corporate life, and which I don't think many people do. It's actually the glorification tends to be in entrepreneurialism, startup life, creative, makers, all this kind of corporates like bad, boring, dull, traditional, slow, lazy, maybe even. And I didn't want it to be like that, because that wasn't really my experience of it. Incredibly bright, capable, really, fun people to work with in the main. And so I think, and neither do I say, right, leave corporate life and never return to it. I think, there are moments in your life when it does really suit you. And I'm not saying for me even, it would be a bit embarrassing, I suppose, but I would not say never go back into a corporate job. And actually a lot of the work I do is with corporates. That's one of the themes of the book, really, that actually just changing the relationship with the corporate might be the right answer for you, rather than necessarily like jacking it all in and doing something totally different.
Yeah.
So your journey, I think, is just as interesting, deepening into a corporate life, and who knows, maybe you'll stay, that will be your career for life, or it may just lead to something else. And I think in a way, it's just a much more modern, really honest way of living, that you're not so fixed. I think, many people, certainly my age, we watched our parents really kind of cling onto these jobs throughout their whole lives. And there was a sort of fear of the unknown, a fear of losing them, because, what could you do? And, I watched my own dad at sort of maybe my age now, 50, maybe a little bit younger, lose his job. And, and he never went back to sort of conventional career after that. So I think it can be quite terrifying, and, but it doesn't need to be, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the things is like, it's just no matter what you do, so much of the negativity ends up coming because there's so much status attached to the job. And this is where I think corporate has sort of gotten its reputation of maybe being a bit drab, because it had this thing of like people were pushed into it because it carried a certain amount of social status. Now that social status has probably shifted to the entrepreneurial space.
Yeah,
Going
I think
like,
that's
oh,
right.
there's this status of, oh, you're an up and goer startup. You're the next big next toy on the block. And so really, it's about if you can sort of just get away from that thinking and just get more to the point of what it is that you're wanting to achieve with your life. And trying to forget some of that social status stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's it. That's really interesting, because I think the what you actually see is younger people going into careers these days are just doing them for they're following it for the moment. They have a much sort of shorter wavelength view on that career in that particular job than maybe people did at my age going into that. And that's, and again, I think that's just a much more healthy way of approaching work. Is it, am I enjoying it? Am I getting what I need out of it? Is it sort of paying the bills? Is it giving me the development I want? Is it leading me to the next thing? But it doesn't necessarily all need to then be in the same company or same industry even. It's just then move to do something else. And I think, that's how we should be living our lives, really, not feeling like we've got a chain dragging us all the way through. And of course, the other thing that's happened, I mean, I don't know what it's like where you live, but the benefits of staying in corporate jobs aren't what they once were anyway. The golden handcuffs, the pensions aren't as good as they were, the redundancy payments aren't as good as they were. So I think there's less incentive for people to stay than there was, say, 10, 15, 20, definitely longer years ago, particularly if you got in a good job. I worked at BP and it was, it's built off the civil service, really. And so final salary pension, really nice. They really looked after you well, healthcare and great kind of perks of working abroad, expat jobs. And then, there's a lot of really, really great benefits of staying, but they're all getting eroded over time as these companies, can't really afford those benefits anymore. So the people coming into them aren't getting the same benefits as I had. And so I think the whole dynamic shifts, the younger people don't want it, but actually the corporates can't offer it.
Yeah, it's a whole new landscape, isn't it? Like, I'm trying to remember the doco I was watching once, and it was I think it was sort of talking about like the previous system of the pension and stuff, which is essentially in Australia being superseded by super, what that we call it. I don't know if you would call it what it's called in the UK.
Just pension,
it's essentially you get your payment that is building up now instead of getting a payment that you're receiving from the government in post-work life. And the changes that made to sort of corporate structures and stuff is really interesting. But I couldn't really comment myself on, I'm not sure how the changes and what they look like compared to 50 years ago in Australia.
Almost definitely worse, I would say. The terms, they do, just can't afford these things. People are living longer, aren't they? I mean, that's what's really shifted. Not only has populations increased, immigration and various things, but also people are living longer. So those pensions that only needed to, carry you for 5, maybe 10 years now need to carry you for 15, 20 years. I mean, I spoke to somebody the other day whose dad has spent longer retired than he ever did working for the company, and he's had a final salary pension as part of his job. So he actually paid in for a shorter amount of time than he's actually received now as a pension, which is unaffordable for any business.
That's wild. How old is he?
Yeah, well, I guess he must be. Yeah, I mean, he must be nearly 90, maybe, I suppose. Yeah, so he retired at 60. Yeah, I mean, it's conceivable, isn't it? Worked for 30 years, say, 30 to 60, maybe even less, 55, and he's 85, 90. So, yeah, so that is not affordable for a company. Not to have many people like that. You can have ones and twos like that, maybe just about, but not to have so many people as there are.
Good luck to all your startups.
yeah, that's right.
Good luck to all your startups trying to pay the wages of something.
Yeah,
work for you.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really interesting. So, keen to dive into these 5 steps and talk through and have you sort of expand on them a bit. So, the 5 steps are detach, audit, explore, exit, sustain. So let's start with detach. Do you want to unpack that for us?
Yeah. So I mean, the whole method really, like I say, it's almost sort of what's the word? It's not that I observed it. It's not that I wrote it down and then started to sort of even see it. I only saw it by talking to people and realized they'd gone through this this sort of same method. And the more people you speak to, actually, and then I started testing the method with people. I said, did you work in this kind of way? And so I sort of validated that was what was happening. And it's super high level. I mean, I'm not saying it's it's some brainwave here that no one's ever heard of, but what I noticed in these people that had left successfully was they had followed broadly this method. And so, as you said, it begins with detaching, and that's necessary because, as you said, the status of working in these places builds identity and reputation. So that's one kind of input to how we're feeling, and another is that sense of dependency on the company for the income, but also for that that identity again too. So and there are feelings of that this is the only thing I can do. There's sort of myths that we end up carrying, which are myths. They're not true, but we start to believe them because we've done the same thing for so long. We start thinking this is it. And I've got a really strong belief that part of the reason our confidence tends to decrease over time in a corporate job is because we're not tested in the same way. If you're jumping around, going for jobs all the time, you're constantly proving that you've got value in the outside world. And when you're staying in a corporate job, particularly if you stay in it for multiple years, you're not proving yourself anymore. You get given that job, you tend to get given the space to do that job. And as a consequence, you may feel quite confident in that job, but the idea of being outside of that job becomes more of a worry. And so there's some work to do to detach, to take away some of those, break down some of those myths, to have a more honest view of yourself and of the role that job provides for you. So in the book, there's exercises all the way through the book. There's like 20 exercises through the book. And those early ones are really about just trying to be really honest around what you're getting from that job and what it's really, what you're giving up for that job. So there's a balanced equation that we really want when we're happy at work, where we're getting as much as we're giving. And sometimes they're different things as well. So when you start in your career, you're willing to trade time and money even for the development and the opportunities you're going to get. Maybe you're going to get to go traveling or whatever, or the projects are really exciting, or it's a great brand to work for. And then over time, some of those needs change, and particularly when you get sort of middle-aged, just getting more salary or getting a promotion actually may not be what you want. And certainly an expat assignment may be the last thing you really want when you've got young kids and in a family and you want some stability. So part of this is just sort of stepping back and saying, have those things changed? And of course, the world has changed a lot too. So you may not be carrying a very accurate view of what the world outside looks like, as well as the opportunities that exist outside. So that first section there is about trying to build that really honest appraisal of the relationship you've got with the corporate, and are some of those things that you're carrying true or not, and do you need to challenge them and look at them in a different way?
Yeah, and there's probably an element of mourning that if you, within that audit process, as you start to realise, oh, maybe it is a time for me to move on, and maybe this isn't serving me in the way that it once did. And there's an element of mourning of like, I've loved this job and this job's done so much for me, and I've been here so long, and all my best friends work here and all that stuff. And it's sort of like you got to grieve that a little bit.
Well, I think that's right. I think there's lots of emotions in there too, because I think you're right that fear of, well, I mean, you look sort of beyond it and think, actually, I'm going to regret this, or I'm going to grieve when I no longer have it, or even a sort of sense of shame that you're no longer in that, and you particularly for that loss of status, as you mentioned there, that somehow there's failure attached to any decision to leave. But of course, the likelihood is, if you don't make that decision to detach, the company at some stage will make that decision for you to detach. You may go all the way through to the time when you want to leave, like a pension wage, and retire, or you may be forced into it through a restructure. So that detachment will happen at some stage, because you're unlike, well, I mean, you could die in service, I suppose, but you're statistically, you're not likely to die in service. So you are going to, at some stage, be told to leave. So this is about, rather than waiting for that to happen and being a victim to that, instead to to walk more into it and more positively go through that experience and test whether that some of those things are true. But I totally agree. I think a lot of this is very emotional, because we've built up so much of our lives around this, and that whole identity piece is particularly important, I found, talking to people, because like me, I didn't ever introduce myself. Oh, people say, what do you do? I didn't even say what I did as my job. I just said I worked at BP. It sort of was enough to sort of satisfy the curiosity of, or the polite chit chat, at least, when you meet somebody. I would say 1 in 10 would say, what do you do there? Most people, it just was enough, because often when we're having that sort of small chat conversation with somebody, small talk, we're just wanting to pigeonhole them, really, aren't we? What kind of person are you? Oh, you're a corporate guy. Oh, you're a banker. Oh, you're a tradie. Whatever it might be, you're really just trying to sort of make sense of where these people fit. And often it's about us, of course, not really about the other person anyway. And so for me to just be walking around always just saying that's who I work for, eventually it starts to define you and characterize you. And everybody I knew I worked at BP. I'd worked there so long. So even friends and family outside knew me as a guy that worked at BP. So it starts to define a lot more of you than you expect. It sort of surprises you in a way when you step back and look. Actually, so much is tied up with this. And of course, it might be financially tied. I mean, everything, all my whole future was tied up with that company's success. My pension, my salary, my bonuses, and what I did with that, and share options tied up. Everything was tied up with it. So I'm literally walking around carrying this huge banner, but so much of my life is dependent on this too. So for me, there was quite a lot of unpacking and detaching from that to sort of start to see it for what it was, and also to sort of realize it wasn't some benevolent, paternalistic figure in my life that was there going to always look after me. It wasn't, and you start to believe some of these things after a while too. It was an organization that had profit as primary motive and shareholder value or something, and it was going to make objective decisions about whether I was part of its future or not. And there wasn't loyalty there really. And I'm not being negative about it. It's just like a fact. It's sort of very rational decision-making organization. And I, like many people, was attaching more of an emotional connection to it than it was to me. And so it was a good wake-up call. When it happened, it was a good wake-up call.
Yeah. Audit.
Well, the second bit is really what I noticed about the people that were most successful is they didn't just immediately jump to something, because when you do that, the likelihood is you're just going to jump to another corporate job because that's all you know. So you're going to, I spoke to somebody yesterday who was working for one corporate and was thinking, was fed up, but there was a restructure, and he was just going to another corporate to do an almost similar job. I mean, you could probably have struggled to see much difference in the job description, because that's the easiest thing to do. But it was the worst decision to do, because if he wasn't happy here, why would he be any happier there? So the audit bit is really about doing that proper step back and looking at all your skills, experience, your knowledge, everything and also what energizes you, because again, that may be different now than it was 10 years ago, or when you last thought about some of these things. So it's about having that really deep inquiry on yourself and what you do really, really well, and what you really do not like or do not do so well, to start to define what kind of offer you could make to somebody else besides the corporate you work for. And maybe it's another corporate, maybe that's fine. Maybe it's you want to do something for yourself. Maybe you want to do social enterprise. That comes later in the sort of exploration phase. But right now, you want to be very, you want to be really like a really great friend who's looking at you and seeing you in how they see you, which tends to be much more positive than we see ourselves, particularly if you've had a bit of a bad time in a corporate job. This whole kind of toxic culture and all these different trends around people doing the bare minimum and the confidence really declining. So you really want to have that step back and look very objectively and fairly and nicely at yourself and say, what do I really offer? And, you say to somebody, oh, in the early days, I do some coaching and I always ask these questions of people, and they instantly go, and I would have been the same, to the job description. What do I do today? And they can kind of reel off some bullets of things that they do today. But actually, of course, it's like an iceberg underneath what you're showing off today. There's a whole load of things you've done that have led up to that. And some of those are very transferable and you don't give yourself much credit for those. So again, I've got some exercise in the book that are really about trying to draw out some of those things that we do, particularly in a corporate job, that we just become completely unconscious of after a while because we just do them. They become second nature. Everyone around us works in that way. We just forget that in the outside world, people don't work in that way. And actually what we are doing is here could be quite valuable to somebody else outside. So it's about trying to have that honest appraisal of what you do and what you can bring. And usually it's quite revealing when people do it because we don't do enough of this sort of stuff really, unless you're going for a job and then you're forced to look back and say, well, crikey, what can I do when I'm asked these awful questions in an interview? Unless you've had that opportunity, you won't have done it very, very recently.
Yeah. What's an example of an exercise or something that someone could do if they're wanting to try and self-assess what skill sets they're learning in a
Yeah, so I've got one in the book called, it's a bit of a cringeful title, You're Sexy and You Know It. But it's really, the S it's not spelt like sexy really, it's SEKSE, and it's skills. So they're the things that you've really learned, experience, the things that you've done, typically the jobs you've done, projects you've run. K is the know-how or knowledge, things you know. S is the strengths, the things that are kind of innate in you that you've probably nurtured during your career, but they're kind of strengths as opposed to weaknesses, things that are almost built in. And then E is the energizers. And I just do an exercise. I mean, the first thing to do is to try and pull that data together. So whether it's you might have some CV, you might have performance appraisals, reviews, you might have emails people I've given you before with feedback on. You might have done psychometric tests, some of those profiling kind of things. So pull together this sort of data and then just really look through it and see if you start to see patterns. And then I just encourage people to sort of cluster them into those 5 buckets there. And it's often quite revealing, the consistency, particularly when you look over the last 5-10 years, you start to see these patterns and you give yourself a bit more credit for some of the things that you can do that you've stopped really thinking about. So that's I think super easy exercise. If I do it with clients, I try and get them to have a different color sticky for each of them, just do it on a wall or something. It's a really great exercise. Really, you can't help but feel good about yourself when you realize there's so many things that you can do. And I've got another one which is really good for corporates, which is called 6 Prisms, which trying to draw out some of those things that you do in a corporate job that you just become so routine. Like you can't help but think strategically in a corporate. You can't make anything happen unless you tie what you're doing to something bigger in the context of the company and the goals. So you naturally think quite strategically, even if you've not worked in strategy. You can't help but think about stakeholders in a corporate because you can't get anything done unless you get the buy-in from outside. So you're always thinking about who do I need to engage? Where's the influence? Who makes the decisions on these things? Risk, of course, a big one. You can't help but think about risk. Corporates are fairly risk averse. They want to have all the risks really laid out, so it's really transparent, and then mitigations against each of those risks. So you start to have a sort of instinct for risk. So there's a couple more like that of these sort of prisms through which you look at any opportunity or decision that's in front of you. you do it like, yeah, by second nature in the end. But it's not really. You've just learned to do this because you've probably screwed up at some stage where a stakeholder comes out of the woodwork and you hadn't noticed, and it throws your plans into jeopardy, or a risk somebody sees that you haven't seen, maybe because you haven't consulted that stakeholder. So so you learn through experience to get really good at these things. And when you go into the outside world, people really value those things because for example, somebody super entrepreneurial or super creative may not have some of those skills, and you can be really complementary to them in what you do choose to do next.
Yeah, the hardcore entrepreneur doesn't even know the meaning of risk assessment.
No, and you don't want them to either. I mean, it'd be what a waste of his talent to be tied up thinking about risk. I mean, in a way, that's why I came out and thought I was going to be an entrepreneur, and I think some of that stuff, stifled my success because I couldn't help but think about reputation or perfection or risk or all these things that we kind of naturally do in a corporate. So it's playing to your strengths again. So it's recognizing, I've built these really amazing talents here, these skills here. What could I use them for? Rather than sort of beating yourself up about what you haven't got, it's playing to strengths all the time.
Yeah. And I actually almost did that before I even went into my latest role. I essentially was taking it because there was certain things I wanted to learn that I thought would be good for building my skill set that I could learn in this role. That I wouldn't necessarily, even though it's like in my mind, I'm like, I might be happy to stay for, way longer than I ever thought. But also I could see where it could take me in terms of going back into the sort of different industries that I'd been in with new skill sets and ability to sort of maybe operate at a higher level and stuff. And so, when you're doing that audit, identifying this is what I do well, this is what I'm passionate about, this is where I want to develop further, and then actively, work towards that, and then keep building upon, the skills and the strengths that you've become aware of, and you know what you do well, and you know where you're weak, and then you know how to sort of bring that balance to all of that. Well, who
or
get around me so that I.
Yeah, exactly. Or you recognize actually these are just weaknesses, and whereas in my corporate career I had to sort of work harder to overcome those weaknesses. For example, I'm absolutely terrible at finances and and budgets and stuff like that. It was just I hated doing them. I just used to do them just to kind of get them done and then move on and then never look at them until challenged, and which wasn't even that often, to be honest. So I was sort of fairly safe in my weaknesses. But like now I know I don't like doing that sort of stuff. So I don't look for any jobs where they have things like that. And if there are things like that, I say, I don't do that. You need to find somebody else to do that. That's not what. And I think, again, that's an opportunity here when you leave. You just like, actually, I know what I'm good at. And I'd rather I can add so much more value doing stuff that I'm good at than I can by just trying to juggle many things. And in a way, I think I did that a bit too much in my corporate job. I'd say yes to things that I wasn't really very good at. And I had to work extra hard just to kind of be as good as somebody that was pretty average at that. I'd have to work really hard to be average versus working not that hard to be amazing at the things that I do really well. And I think that's also one of the things that I think comes out of that audit. You recognize that these weaknesses are like a huge drag on your energy and potentially your success too. And so why on earth would you carry them with you if you're going to go and do something different?
Yeah, absolutely. Moving into explore.
Yeah, so explore is that is other in the book is other people's stories, because obviously it would be thoroughly boring just to read my story. So I've included lots of stories throughout it because I want to inspire people and also build their confidence too, that they can do what others are doing. So lots of different stories of what people have done next, and also how they left, how they prepared, so that they didn't take this big sort of leap out of nowhere and just kind of land. Hopefully, they'd actually stepped into it or stepped over into it rather than like take a huge leap. And so then there's sort of practical tips in there really coming out too. Just because my experience, again, of myself, but also of lots of people I met and still meet today in corporate jobs, is we can be a bit boxy about things. And, you sort of think, okay, I could be a consultant, and we have a stereotypical view of what a consultant does, which may not always be a very positive view either of what, of these jobs. And so it's really easy for us to just cross them out and just say, okay, I don't want to be a consultant. But actually, a consultant is a really broad spectrum of different roles, from somebody that you may not want to do, like if you've seen it in your job, which is like somebody just comes in and does reports on things and then disappears again, to somebody who's really quite involved in the business, effectively body shopping and filling a role for somebody else. Others that are, running projects and will come in for fixed periods of time. Others that are experts, others that are advisors. There can be consultants that are like more coaches, really. So, there's a whole spectrum of things. And I want that part of the book to really open people's minds so they don't stay in boxes, which I think are just very easy to say no to. It's really hard to say no to a spectrum. I couldn't do anything on this spectrum here. So that's what I'm trying to encourage in that section of the book. Inspire and build confidence and just open minds. And that's what I saw people did. The successful people didn't just jump to obvious things. They thought a bit. They also experimented a bit too. They weren't so fixed about what they thought they would do next. They were prepared to meander a little to find where it worked, because it is hard from a job to imagine yourself in another thing that's not fairly similar to what you're doing. So you may have to try a few lily pads before you find the right one.
Yeah. And that is, in its word, exploring.
Yeah.
So, and then moving into the exit.
Yeah. So that's actually that's the move. And as part of that, though, what I really identified was there were some gaps that people had before they should move, how they're properly ready. One of those is identity. And I think best to do some work on that before you find yourself with an identity crisis on the wrong side, which I think is quite easy. From the small, seemingly inconsequential things like meeting somebody from your old workplace who asks you what you're up to, and you like, you can't really articulate something, and then you walk away feeling terrible, embarrassed, and shameful. To building up that identity that you then can sell in some kind of way to others. So identity is a big piece. Second one is network. Usually the networks that people have in corporate life when they leave their corporate jobs aren't really useful to them outside. You hope they're going to be quite useful. They can be useful, of course, if lots of people are leaving, but the network you had when you were in the job was really to get the job done, and now you need a different one. Of course, ideally, you've built that network up before you leave. That de-risks your exit. But even not, there are ways to build your network up. So there's a chapter on that, and there's a chapter on capabilities too, because one of the things I observe again in corporate people, I look at, and I've seen it, the temptation myself, is to just go to training. Before I go and do anything, I need to be trained. I need a qualification. I need to go back to university and study before I'm going to do something. And I think it's a bit of a cop-out. It's a bit of you're deferring the imposter syndrome, I think. And the imposter syndrome is going to hit you anyway. But, just having a certificate or a diploma or a picture of you with hat on, a gown on, is not really going to change anything there in terms of the imposter syndrome. You need to just get out there and work. Now, obviously, there are some fields where you do need the qualification, so I'm not writing off qualifications at all. But I think I observed it in myself several times when I started businesses. I thought, do you know what? I think I better go to university and do something before I start building this business, or I better get a coaching qualification before I start coaching people. These things that are really just deferring the awkwardness of having to go to market in some way. So there's So there's something about those gaps and being honest about the ones that are really, your exit is contingent on versus the ones that you can work through in a job, on the job, whatever you do next. So that's around that exit and actually the leaving too, and some tips around how to leave well. Yeah, and then the last bit is just sustaining it, really, because just because you've left doesn't necessarily mean all's going to go swimmingly after that. You have wobbles. Some of those wobbles are quite legitimate. You need to work through those things. Certainly money is quite different after the stability of a regular salary, and you need to think and get prepared for that. Things go wrong as well, and you shouldn't feel ashamed about going back to a corporate job or thinking differently about what you're doing either. So but ideally to sort of sustain it and also to sort of know when you've kind of got there as well, because I do think it might take a couple of years to get stable again. It took you a good few years to build that career, so it's only fair to give it a couple of years before you get stable. I would say I feel stable now, but it's like 3 years, 4 years nearly since I left. So it takes some time.
Yeah. And if you've done that identity piece well, then you're not going to be as worried about going back if you have to just go back for a stint, and maybe you are sort of looking like, all right, I just need to have some stable finances for 12 months or 6 months.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's no shame in going back if you've exited going, I didn't exit because it defined who I am.
Yes, exactly.
There's something else I want to focus on now.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, you have to do the work to get out, because I think you do get quite attached to that identity. But I think once you're out, you're just looking a bit more, sort of looking a bit more like what am I going to get out of this? And it's a bit more of a healthy way of looking at work, because you've lost all that kind of like, well, they've been good to me, that kind of thing that creates a sort of sense of loyalty and and friendships kind of, it sort of confuse some of that, I think, sometimes at work. But really you're there to achieve something. It might be development, it might be salary and or stability, it might be the name on the CV that's going to help you get the next job. But it needs to be kind of rational and not be afraid of seeing work as just work. It doesn't have to be something really deeply rooted in you. Where it doesn't have to be purposeful. Sometimes it can just be about making money, being useful in the world, and then as a means to an end for something else in your life. And I think I got, over the years, I think I did get sort of a bit confused in my head around the role of work, that it was really, really self-defining. And now I look at it and think, actually, the main reason I work is to earn money to afford the life outside. And I don't know that I would have admitted that when I was in a career. It felt like some sort of failure, that I obviously hadn't got it right then. If I hadn't found this, miraculous marriage of purpose at work and amazing life outside of work, then I was somehow, missing something. But I think I gave too much weight to work in my life. And I feel much healthier about it now. And I still work a lot. Too much.
Yeah, obviously. And then number 5 is sustain. So how do we sustain it?
Yeah, that is just about managing those wobbles, but also just sort of giving yourself a bit of space and time for it to settle. Because, like I said, it doesn't that certainly that feeling of security and stability doesn't happen overnight. And I left with a redundancy payment, so I had some cover, but because it was not sustainable, that redundancy payment, it didn't make me feel relaxed at all. I felt very anxious for probably the first year, maybe even 18 months, until I started to build a bit of momentum, a little bit of a buffer. started to show that I could do this, I felt quite preoccupied by it. And so sort of just dealing with some of those things so that, like for example, I talk in the book about sort of 3 a.m., which is just like killer time for me. And I just used to wake up quite often and be hard sometimes to go back to sleep before sort of 5 or whatever. And then, of course, you wake up at 6 in the morning. It seems ridiculous what you were worrying about then. So I started to teach myself ways to just almost bat these worries away, and just with some logic, So, the worries about finance and, what if that doesn't happen and this client says no to this and this doesn't come off when I expect it, and just kind of give myself confidence. Actually, no, you've got a buffer here. You can manage this 3 months without worrying about it, 4 months or whatever it might be. And I just have answers to calm that kind of annoying voice in your head that at 3 a.m. is much harder to quieten than it is at 3 p.m. Or distract yourself out of. So just trying to get very a bit more proactive, so that when the wobbles happen, the anxiety hits you, you can fend it off better. But also knowing when you're there, because I think if you're not careful, you're always looking like, you can be a bit like, when is this all going to end and I'm going to have to go back? And so just recognizing, actually, the things that I set out to achieve are making work for me here. So that when you see something tempting, which you always see on LinkedIn, I mean, even today, there was something ridiculous on LinkedIn, and I thought, maybe that looks interesting. It's like so ridiculous, and so knowing why are these things that I'm doing really important to me, so that whenever those sort of tempting things arise, I can compare them against that and say, well, actually, it doesn't do this, that, and that's actually more important to me than the 3 things it is offering. So again, it's just a little bit about being a bit more transparent, opening these things up a bit, so you can knock the things away that are just rubbish and filter them, I suppose, and concentrate on what's really valuable and what you're really enjoying about this life. And keep testing that. Actually, is it really important? Like for me, one of the things is about being sort of more involved in my family than I was. But there may come a point when the family's starting to disappear, and to be more involved in the family is actually a bit lonely. There's no one really here. So, so testing those things, whether those things that were important to you 5-6 years ago are still important to you. I think I still need to keep doing that all the time, because that's what got me a bit trapped, I think, before. So I don't want to be trapped in this life if it's no longer serving me.
Adam, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to getting my hands on the book.
Yes, 2nd of July.
How can people be doing that? Yeah, 2nd July.
Yeah, 2nd of July.
Get it on pre-sale.
Yeah, you can. It's on pre-order on Amazon. But I've got a blog as well in the meantime, Corporate Escapologist. It's on Substack, if you know Substack. Had that for a few years now. I've got an Instagram page at Corporate Escapologist as well. I just put some tips and things there. So very keen for some new followers from Australia. That'd be lovely.
Yeah, well, I'll link that all in the show notes, and we'll get this episode up and out and into the world. And definitely encourage people to be connecting with you and following along. I think it's going to be a really good book to read, and it's been a really good conversation today.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Alex. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks very much for having me.